Okay, so we may as well start. I think you all know me, but for anybody who doesn't, my name is Ray and I'm the creative coordinator of the Mollies Masquerade, which is a heritage lottery community arts project that's going to start in September in St Margaret's House in Bethnal Green, on the history of the Mollies and the Molly houses. So for 200 years, a Molly was a slang word for a gay man or an effeminate man, and also a lower class woman who could have been a sex worker. And so our project is going to look at the life of both the Mollies and the Molly houses. So yeah, today we are talking to Alex Etchart, who is going to be the musical director of our project. He was also the musical director of the Sex Workers Opera. And I actually know from the Fire Choir, which is the most amazing protest choir that was set up by Sam Lee. Alex, do you want to tell us a bit about your work?
Hello everyone, my name's Alex Etchart. My pronouns are they, them, as opposed to she, her, he, him. And yeah, I'm a music maker, composer, also theatre maker. I'm Anglo-Uruguayan, so half from South America. I grew up in the South American folk music tradition, but since then have branched kind of into jazz and songwriting and a lot of folk, including from the British Isles and Irish traditions as well. And I'm one of the two co-founders of Sex Workers Opera. That's an opera created and performed by sex workers and friends of sex workers. And yeah, we've got a community of around 35 people who over 5 years created, performed, toured to 9 different countries, I believe, to date. The show is written by from the experiences of our members and also from over 100 stories that were sent in from around the world, from 18 countries across 6 continents. So extraordinarily exciting. And I will show you a video about it very promptly. And before I do say that, I will say that the group are always 50% sex workers at all times, and we don't reveal who is and who isn't a sex worker. And that's to ensure people are able to be part of the project, be on stage, without necessarily breaking their anonymity or outing themselves, which obviously could lead to all kinds of repercussions, including losing employment, losing family, friends, and because of the stigma that is still so prevalent social-wide. But I thought maybe a nicer way to connect to the project and then see how the tools that were used in that project will be brought into this project in some exciting ways as well, with all the different mediums that we have here and the extraordinary artists we're collaborating with, might be more sensory. So I'll share that video now. Give me a moment. Can you all see that image? Fabulous. I'll go from the beginning of the video. I'm going to be a bit rude and skip a few bits just because it's a 6-minute video and I'm sure we don't need to watch. Going to pause there, apologies, and just skip through so we get to the point we're performing in Amsterdam. There we are arriving. Oh, I'm playing close pick to fight. Always a creative group. Now let's see. Warming up.
take photos.
You can hit me harder, it's fine.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's what?
A jazz cigarette.
I'm just going to pause there, and for the last little teaser, I'm going to show how we participated in the International AIDS Conference, which had about 14,000 people attending from all around the world, from pharmaceutical companies to policymakers, government officials, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates. And that is, oh, sorry, you're missing Amsterdam Pride. So for those who don't know, Amsterdam Pride has got a boat parade every year, which is extraordinary. And there are boats for all kinds of different communities from the LGBTQ plus community, including the sex worker boat. So that is a brief overview of our project and show. And yeah, importantly, you know, every lyric and every chord of the show was written by our members. So hopefully we'll bring some of that energy to Mollies.
Yes, I think a really important part of that is allyship. So you say sex workers and their allies, and I think for the Mollies Masquerade, we're also this is our goal as well. You know, that we have lots of different groups that are going to be part of the project, whether, you know, and that it's something that we can all stand in solidarity with each other, whether that's sex workers' rights or trans rights or migrants' rights, that it's important that out each other and that we're all there to show solidarity towards one another. So if we look, because our project is based in from 1700 to 1820, the 18th century, the long 18th century. And so to talk a little bit about language, so when we read about this period in history, it will usually be that homosexuals are regarded as, are described as sodomites and sex workers as prostitutes. Although there are many other names for sex workers, and I'll read you a few that I've got from Hallie Rubenhold.
Before you do that, Ray, can I get everyone to write the names that they are aware of for sex work? Mm-hmm. And by doing that, you're not saying that you agree with the use of that word, but it's just really interesting to hear all the words that you guys know. Can you type them into the chat? Really curious to think of, you know, you can use any of the words, and I know some of them will obviously be words that might be considered offensive, but it's just really useful to know what's in your minds. Tollop, trade, rent.
Rent.
Stuart, you sent that to me. Hooker, dilly boy, or yeah.
Dilly boy.
Yeah, of course, there are specific ones applying to men, aren't there, often? Trade again, yeah. Any others that come to mind? Any that are kind of somewhere in between, maybe suggest higher class, or are kind of playing around with it? Escort, hooker, yeah. People might say courtesan.
Yes.
Tart, love it. And so many of these are inter-apply to the queer community and sex work community, aren't they? Sorry, Ray.
No, carry on. That's
really
useful. Thank you for making it interactive, Alex. So some of the ones that I found were women of the town, members of the Cyprian Corps, impures, strumpets, wantons, jades, hussies, tarts, this was my personal favourite, votaries of Venus, nymphs, Jezebels, doxies, moles, fallen women, trollops and harlots. But for this project, we want to make sure that we call sex workers, apart from when we're taking texts about history. Can you explain to people who might not have been part of the conversation about why sex worker is a preferable term than prostitute?
Well, I guess because it's perhaps one of the oldest professions, but also one of the most stigmatized parts of human experience. Sex workers has attracted so many different names, which all carry a shade of judgment in them. Certainly most of them. So, for example, the word prostitute is probably one of the most commonly used, and it's nowadays considered by the sex work community a slur, akin to the N word for people of colour, or the F word, we could say, for gay people. So it's a word that really shouldn't be used by someone who's not experiencing it, but of course has been reclaimed, for example, by the English Collective of Prostitutes, who started before actually the word prostitute had kind of been shifted around and sex work had been brought in to question that stigma. Now, one of the ways that the word prostitute really encodes stigma is that it acts as a noun, but also as a kind of verb to prostitute, and prostituted, so kind of an adjective as well. And prostituted, for example, suggests that someone else has done this to you. So you have been exploited, which again carries a shade of judgment in there. Now, that's not to say that there's no one who's ever been exploited before in the world, whether in sex work or in other sex industry or other professions and other places. But to use and to simplify someone to a prostituted person, prostituted woman, obviously most often, is already taking away their agency, and it's a slur. It's got a kind of heaviness to it. So Carol Lee, who's a wonderful activist and artist from the United States, originally from New York and now in the Bay Area, who looks over the Sex Worker Film Festival in the Bay Area in the US, in the late 70s coined the term sex work in a conference. In fact, the conference itself, if I can find the reference, was about the sex use industry. And within that conference, she pushed for it to be called the sex industry, because use, being used, again, has these shades of being controlled and manipulated. And she says about the term sex work that the invention of the term was motivated by my desire to reconcile my feminist goals, because she was a feminist activist, with the reality of my life. She was a sex worker and had been a sex worker for many years, and the lives of the women I knew. I wanted to create an atmosphere of tolerance within and outside the women's movement, of women working in the sex industry. And I think that what I like about the word sex work is it fundamentally ties it back, takes away in a way the obsession with sex and sensuality and roots it in work, labour. That why are people doing this? Why is money being exchanged in the first place? Why does anyone do any job in capitalism? To survive, to live. And so if we take it from a labour perspective, we can start to think about, well, what safeties are in place and what rights do those workers, those labourers have, whether or not sex, sensuality, body, and how much body is involved in different ways, essentially. And we're going to be exploring throughout this talk. Obviously, that will bring up reactions in all of us, because we're, oh, but still, it's such a difficult, oh, why would you do that? Oh, horrible. You know, we've been trained very well by the media we've consumed to kind of think of it as an abominable thing. And over this session, I hope to kind of explore all the different angles that can get us to tease out, not by the end of it all walk out into the streets and say, I'm going to be a sex worker now, it is the revolution, but just to kind of take all the emotional weight out of the conversation around sex work, so we can look to being better solidaritous allies to sex workers.
Good. Sex work is known as the oldest profession in the world. Is that accurate?
Well, as a historian of all the world, or historian, I can tell you yes or no answer. I mean, I think before we look at whether or not it predates most other professions, what is sex work? I'm going to ask you a series of questions, And I want you to raise your hands to the top if you're like, that's definitely sex work. I want you to have them at the bottom of your screen if that's not sex work. And maybe somewhere in the middle if you're undecided. So sleeping with a person for money. Just a little tester there. Is that sex work? Is it not sex work? Is it questionable? Lovely, thank you. That's pretty much the common description. What about sleeping with someone richer than you for status or for nice jewelry? We've got some middles. We've got some middles. We've got some highs. We don't really know. Is it a spectrum? Does it depend? What is the situation and all that? Okay, you're very, very poor and you've had very few opportunities in life. Does that question change for you then if I tell you that? Sleeping with someone who's got a big house so you can potentially stay with them and maybe even have a romantic relationship with them? No? Roughly the same kind of answer? Okay, great. Sleeping with a Hollywood director to get the role in that big film to make your big break. Is that sex work? We've still got some highs, we've got some slightly lowers. Oh, it's in the arts industry. Oh, maybe we relate too much. Who knows? Again, you know, it could be sleeping with your boss. You know, where is it going? You know. Okay, how about arranged marriages? Arranged marriages. Now, we might kind of stereotypically think of South Asia, for example, as the kind of modern stereotype. But what about, you know, 18th century, 19th century? You know, your well-to-do father decides to match you with a good lauded, landed family, and you have no choice over the matter. Is that sex work? We've got some mediums, quite a lot of mediums. Well, I think what's very interesting is in that situation, actually, you have no agency, you're not choosing to do it. And the benefit and the dowry might actually go to your father and their family, not necessarily to you directly, but you might benefit with status and class, but you might hate the arrangement. So, you know, it's really good to start unpicking, you know, where does that come in? Before we go even further, I'm going to be cheeky and ask, has anyone here ever consumed sex work? Do you think you've ever consumed sex work? I'm going to say like that. Okay, has anyone here ever watched pornography? You've consumed sex work. Dun, 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 dun. That is the little gag that I have, and it's true. You know, it's so normalised, it's so accessible, it's so everywhere, it's so every day, and yet we wouldn't identify as a client. I didn't, you know, and maybe we consumed it for free because people don't like to pay porn actors for their labour very often. You know, so you know, sex work is more pervasive than we even choose to admit to ourselves. And then going on a historical context, you know, if we're going to break that down even further, it's labour that involves the body in a sensual way. Maybe it involves parts of the body that we don't use in other labour. So difference between a blacksmith and a sex worker, maybe they're using their genitalia, maybe even they're just using sensuality, maybe they're not using their genitalia, maybe they're not providing sexual services, but a sugar baby might be making you feel like you're the best boyfriend in the world, just so you can feel happier, feel nicer for that moment, you know. And then it gets blurry as well with theatre and the performance world. So my question is, you know, Mary Magdalene, well, we know at least 2,000 years ago, very well documented sex workers. In the times of the first cities in Mesopotamia, we have, you know, the first kind of empires and cities being going through wars, and wars resulting in domination of one city by another, and you end up with debt. People have to pay off that debt in the development of money. And so that'd be around the first time that people might have to exchange services for coin and for gold, or currencies that maybe they're not even used to. People might have to migrate to other cities for opportunities. And of course, if you're arriving in a new city, you've got no relationships, you've got no family, you've got no support systems, you're very likely to find work. Maybe you don't even speak the language, and you're likely to do lower class work and work that you have less options over. You're not going to go in and suddenly be an apprentice blacksmith to the greatest blacksmith in town. You might end up using your body. And then, of course, when gender's factored in and you're a woman, potentially in patriarchal societies where women didn't have so many options, you might have to marry someone that you don't necessarily want to marry to survive, and you may have to do sex work to survive. Question, just to be extra controversial, was Jesus a really well-documented client? I don't know. Or was Jesus actually one of those really annoying guys who's trying to get a freebie and just says some really poetic stuff to make sure Mary Magdalene sleeps with him? A bit like Christian from Moulin Rouge, who's the starving poet. Oh, you don't want to be a sex worker. You want to go off with me with my no money and no opportunities and no anything. Is there a coincidence he's called Christian? I'll leave that thought with you.
Brilliant. So let's try and look a bit at the history of the Mollies. We're trying to root everything in the Mollies history. So one of the books that is really difficult to get hold of, but is basically the Mollies Bible, is Mother Clapp's Mollies House. In it, Rick Norton talks about potentially the relationship between the women sex workers working in the bawdy houses and the men in the Molly houses. They might not have had a good relationship with each other. And he gives an example, which I'll read to you, of a newspaper article which was written by a journalist in response to Covent Garden sex workers who were aggrieved that they were losing trade to the Mollies. And then they printed the letter, and it says, "The other night we had a general meeting at a gin shop where it passed, with nobody contradicting, to return you our hearty thanks for endeavouring to suppress the notorious practice of the Mollies, by which abuse of nature we may properly call ourselves the greatest sufferers. For of late, several of our Christian acquaintances have resorted to the Jews, and in particular, my old friends, Mr. P, who has left me and learnt a way to go to the devil backwards." And then this is accompanied by a verse, and it says, you stand indicted in the public news for innovations offered at the stews. What cursed devil brought this trick in vogue to spite a whore and doubly damn a rogue, to change the laws of nature vice versa, and set a whore to prayers? The Lord have mercy. He then goes on to say that he suspects the author of the poem is a witty male journalist, but it could also be true. I thought it's just amusing and I wanted to read you it. But I wanted to talk to you about, because we don't really know what the relationship between the bawdy houses and the Molly houses were. I wanted to ask you, how do you think these histories are related?
Well, I wasn't around at the time, but I do think that it's really important to place queers in sex work history and vice versa. I mean, it's clear that, Molly houses were close to brothels, so there's geographical proximity. Some of them were synonymous with brothels, some of them were brothels as well. But again, on that kind of strand of teasing apart what is sex work, for gay men, for example, or trans women, we don't know how they identified, for a lot of these Mollies who may have been cross-dressing or may have even felt they were different to how they were told they were. If you were escaping criminalisation, if you were escaping violence, if you're escaping homophobia, and the same applies, in 50s, 60s, 70s Britain is applied then, I think, you may have to come to the city, to somewhere where you're more likely able to survive. You might have to be ostracised from your family and have to hide after being found out to be gay, for example, for fear of the law. And you would come to the city, and then how would you make ends meet? And that's where class and sex work are so crucial to observe the connection between. Certainly, if we look at contemporary gay liberation, Martha P. Johnson and his contemporaries in the Stonewall riots were sex workers, and trans women to this day very often are still so excluded, and trans people in general, that they're often sex workers. So I think there's an intimate connection there. And if you think of upper class gay men or lords, perhaps in the 50s England, 60s England, again coming to London, who are stigmatized and prohibited from expressing their sexuality, you may well go to a Molly house and have community and have access to sex, but you may also pay a sex worker, or it might be one and the same thing, just to be able to express your bisexuality while having a wife and a family at home to perform to social standards and to exist. So I think that, what's interesting about looking at gay male sex work and how it may have connected to the Mollies and how it also connects today is it breaks this trope of sex work being just this purely binary gendered exploitation of women across history. The fact that gay men would have needed access to sex just to breathe, just to be themselves, and that may have come in the form of participating in the Molly community, being part of these rituals. It may have become in the form of exchange. Who knows? If you're a richer Molly, you might have brought those jewels to the table, as we talked about earlier, may have brought and supported or been a patron of the Molly community in some way. I think it's very hard to tease out. What is really clear is that they have a shared oppression at the hands of the state in terms of criminalisation, and at the hands of the church in terms of demonisation.
Brilliant. Great. I now also want to show you some images from Hogarth's A Harlot's Progress, which is some of our most famous images that we have from this period. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay. I absolutely love these images, partly just because there's so much detail in them. So it's basically a story of Moll Hackabout. This is Moll Hackabout, and going to London and getting corrupted. And so she gets picked up by this woman who is meant to be based on a real famous bawd called Elizabeth Needham, I think. Just 5 minutes. Elizabeth Needham, who was kind of famously cruel to the women that she cared for. What's interesting is most of these characters, apart from Mull, were based on real people. There's also the man who eventually buys her is at the back, who was a famous libertine and owned lots of brothels. Both of them were like really unpopular with people in London at the time. But Moll is apparently the one fictional character. She's called Moll Hackabout as well, and her hack might have come from Hackney carriage, which we know is London taxis, which mean they give anybody a ride. And so that's where the name comes from. In the back as well, we've got a member of the clergy who's ignoring her. So it's about the fact that the church is ignoring what Hogarth is saying is this sinful scene. You've also got as well, like she has a rose on her dress, if you can see, which is apparently an ancient symbol of the Virgin Mary, and she's an innocent rose at this point. And at the side, you can see there's falling pots because she's about to become a fallen woman. So that's the first one. The second one, can we see this, is she's in a very glamorous house and it's all very nice, but she's drunk, a boob's foot hanging out, she's knocking the table over, and her client is meant to be a Jewish man. And from the history of it, they said that actually the Jewish clients were really popular for being really caring towards the sex workers. But we also know he's Jewish because the images, the pictures in the background are parts from the Bible and the Old Testament. We also, in this image, can see that on the side table, there's a mask. So she's just been to a masquerade as well, which was a sinful place that you would go to. And at the back, we have a maid and another client being shown out the door. Going on to the next one, we have, she's now in Drury Lane, which is where the poor sex workers would have been, in Covent Garden. And she's there and she's got a maid who's got a syphilitic nose. So her poor maid has lost a bit of a nose, and there's some medicine for her nose at the side. And walking through the door was a famous magistrate. What is his name? Do this, Sir John Gonson, who was a famous Westminster magistrate and part of the Reformation for good manners, who basically were trying to rid London of bawdy houses and molly houses, which it's interesting because on the wall, like this scene, I think these are the most interesting part of it, is you've got a witch's hat. Which kind of suggests the witch trials, which would have been 200 years earlier. And you've also got birches for flogging. which was apparently a really common thing in brothels, but also it was massively common in public schools. So Eton and Westminster would have flogged all the boys there, and then the upper class grew up and then had tastes for sadomasochism. And so you've got that on the wall, and that's what the Westminster judge is looking straight at when he walks in. Then you have other images as well, I think, on the wall that are like famous libertines, and a sacrificial scene from the Bible. Going on, you then have poor Moll has ended up in prison, which you can see there's lots of other women in prison, but her dress is much nicer than everybody else's dress. And then the jailers, who are looking really evil in that woman's face, and she's picking up Moll's clothes to be like, well, I'll have these. And poor Moll is like beating the hemp. And then it's very difficult to see, but there's over here is a hangman, and the hangman is the same name as the Sir John. There's a name there where it's Sir John Gonson, in this kind of suggestion that it's his fault, that the reason they're all there. Going on to the next one, we have poor Moll is dying. So here she is. And you have two doctors here who are rowing about the best cure for syphilis. And she's got a loyal maid here. And the reason apparently that her head is wrapped up is because a common treatment for syphilis would have been mercury, which would have made your teeth fall out. And so she's got a head bandage from that treatment. And then she's got the her board or a landlady going through her trunk, picking stuff up. And there's the witch's hat again. And of course, a poor child as well. The most interesting thing about this part as well is that actually in the corner, you have Passover bread. So it might suggest that the Jewish merchant from the start is paying for the lodgings or paying for the medical treatment. And then the final one is Moll is dead. And she's in the coffin, surrounded by fairly uncaring people. And you've got a member of the clergy there who's got his hand up a woman's skirt, and a child all in black. And then you have her maid looking at the clergyman, and then a young sex worker as well who's looking straight at Moll, seeing that that's what is, that's the future that she's heading for. So yeah, so I think that's it, yes. So let me stop share. So good. I wanted to show these because I thought it was really interesting, because she's very much like an innocent victim. And within one of my favourite books that I've been reading, which is Catherine Arnold's City of Sin.
City of Sin.
City of Sin. I kind of like this one the most because she seems to reserve judgment, moral judgment, where it seemed fairly common of the time for all these men, this kind of journalistic attitude that it's all about innocence corrupted. I wondered if you've got any thoughts on that, Alex.
Yes, I do. Thank you. I mean, it's clear that when we talk about the public and the common narrative around sex work, you know, wicked women controlling them, or men controlling, or pimps, or trafficking mafias. And it's true, when we look at sex work, we have to face injustices. But the question is, where do those injustices come from? And what are those structures? You know, and so I think that before we tackle anything, we have to look at class. We have to look at options and positionality. Before we unpack that, can I ask you to share in the chat box your any films, books, common stories you know about sex workers? Hint, opera is a good place to start, hence why we created Sex Workers Opera. But think about popular films, all the classics. I want to kind of grapple with this narrative, La Traviata, exactly. Where did this narrative of the fallen woman and the only trajectory for a sex worker to be a life of tragedy come from. Taboo, BBC recently. Pose is more recent, absolutely, and it's maybe shifting the narrative, which is amazing. Harlot's ITV series, Crimson Petal and the White. Any more ideas? Pretty Woman is, of course, a classic. Richard Gere saves her. Oh, to be saved by a man. We're all looking for that. I'd love to be saved by a man. I hope it gives me 2 mentions. Cinderella, interesting question. Now that we have opened our minds, you know, where does it start? Where does it end? And does anyone know any other operas, just while we're on the topic, or any musicals, or musicals turned films, or imagined films? Rent, and it's in the title. Les Mis, thank you very much. Again, another classic sex worker tragedy. We have Madame Butterfly. Do we have Madame Butterfly? Do we have, I believe, La Bohème as well? We have, if you look at the history of opera, it's actually spattered with sex workers. And who wrote those characters but rich, old, white men? Across the board, never written, but cisgendered mostly, I imagine, heterosexual mostly, I imagine. Potentially clients, probably very likely clients. Jesus was writing about Mary Magdalene a lot, so, you know, who knows. I think this is a really key thing. Who owns our narrative is a question that's very, very big at the moment. People are accepting that, you know, women directors need to be directing films in Hollywood around women's issues. POC directors need to be directing films that cover POC experience. And the same thing has to happen eventually for sex workers. And what you find when you start looking at sex worker narrative and looking at English Collective of Prostitutes and the information they've been disseminating, for example, is the majority of sex workers are mothers, often single mothers. Majority of sex workers have worked in care, worked in healthcare, worked in domestic labour as well in their lifetimes. So really tying sex work to class. And what's very interesting and what I love in these Hogarth pictures is it shows how sex work being very intimate and often being purchased by richer men, Breakfast at Tiffany's exactly, purchased by richer men, is actually a very interesting place where class, distance and the pyramid of class is kind of subverted. A very rich man has a very intimate experience with the lowliest of women or queers or gay men. And that really inverts the entire kind of class structure on its head. So it reinforces it, but at the same time, there's something very intimate going on there. And I think that sex work, as we talked about, is about migration. And I'll read from The Square of Venus in City of Sin chapter. As I was coming home this night, I felt carnal inclinations raging through my frame. I determined to gratify them. I went to St. James's Park, next to Westminster, no less, and picked up a whore. For the first time did I engage in armour, a condom, which I found but a dull satisfaction. She who submitted to my lusty embraces was a young Shropshire girl, only 17, very well looked, her name Elizabeth Parker. So again, this Elizabeth Parker would have come from the north and come to the big city and needed to find a way to survive. Migration being a key aspect that's connected to sex work, and then ties into travel in terms of migration and sex work, which then is tied to trafficking and often gets complexly conflated. Indeed, Britt McNulty, Director Call Girl. Did you want to say something, Ray? Sorry.
No, thank you for that.
I wanted to kind of expand a little bit, if it's okay, on class and social mobility. Mm-hmm. So these are very poor women, ordinarily, who may have lost their family connections, and sex work and exchange of favours, sugar babying, you know, being a fancy courtesan to a big lord might be a really realistic way to get yourself out of poverty. There's a nice quote again in the same chapter in The City of Sin, which says, it just describes kind of this variety of sex workers and well-known characters who are on the scene. Kitty, who posed for Sir Joshua Reynolds as Cleopatra, was well aware of her value. She charged 100 guineas a night, and she was never without admirers, including the Duke of York, who left £50 on her dressing table one morning, a tip she found so derisory that she refused to see him ever again, then stuck the banknote between 2 slices of bread and butter and ate it for breakfast. And I really love this. And then it goes on to talk about her getting a career in the arts and getting involved in the Beggars' Opera at Rich's Theatre, which did it fantastically well at the time. And she propelled her into the highest ranks and toasts of the town and became the mistress of the Duke of Bolton, finally marrying him. So I think it's very interesting to see how the entire class structure is subverted by a woman who often has very few options in that society and is expected to marry and be a housewife, or at least order the servants about the manor, finds a way to kind of invert those options and access through her sexual power, essentially. So sexual capital, essentially, in a world where men have financial and kind of social capital, then women are left in a position where they have sexual capital and they have to exploit that, which we can make judgments about now and we can say is not our ideal utopia, but we have to observe, with hindsight and with respect to women finding a way within the means they have.
Absolutely. I think we have to there's a lot of complexity in the discussion when we're comparing the early 1700s to today. But like a really good example, I think the best TV example that I've seen is Harlots, where you see they're not pitying them. It's one of the few examples where they're not pitying them and they're not judging them. And since we've been having these discussions, I've recognized that so many contemporary dramas are still really judgmental on sexual women. There is, though, as well, I think the period really created an underclass of women that is serving middle-class men, and there's a hypocrisy in that. I think you mentioned John Gay's The Beggar's Opera, which there's a quote from that which says, "The lower sort of people have their vices in a degree as well as the rich, but only the poor are punished for them." And there is, like, women were punished so much more, like, that image within Hogarth where it's all women in the prison. It was like, there was one statistic I had where in the year 1720, 427 women were arrested for sexually related crimes. Well, in the whole of that decade, 400 men were arrested for sexually related crimes. So actually it was, it was sex workers, working class sex workers that were filling the prisons. And I think we can engage in that and we can look at that as well. One example, though, of the fact that there was so much status between women, I found this quote from the 1730s about a man called Francis Place, who was apprenticed to a London leather breecher makers, and he had 3 daughters. And the eldest daughter, this is his description, the eldest daughter was and had been for several years a common prostitute. His youngest daughter, who was 17 years of age, had genteel lodgings where she was visited by gentlemen, and the second daughter was kept by a captain of the East India ship, in whose absence she used to amuse herself as such women generally do. And so I think it's really interesting that within one family that you've got 3 levels of the profession, from a very kept, very rich woman to, someone the father describes as a common prostitute. But as you say, like, compared to Catholic Europe, where middle-class families would put their daughters in nunneries, all women had to find income in some way. And so a lot of the upper classes, when they took middle-class they were largely because their fathers had become bankrupt. There was no other income for them. I think it also within this, it's slightly out of our time period, but I've just learned about this thing called wardship. And in 1640, there was a change in the law where wardship meant that if you lost your father, so as a woman or heirs lost their father, they could be auctioned off by the state to the highest bidder. And that was just anybody. And it became unpopular and there was a change in the law. And I looked it up recently and it still exists. Wardship, we're not auctioning families off, but it exists in the sense of we're protecting children in case of forced marriage. But, this idea of choice was a total misnomer for the majority of women. And although, you know, it's a huge period that we're looking at from 1700 to 1820, so there is a lot of change in that, and there's more women getting an education. And so some women, some spinsters become governesses, but largely, I think there's a concern that in one of the records, only 1 in 3 women could sign the marriage register in the middle of the 1800s, but twice as many men. So, yeah, so I think it's worth just viewing it in the state of the oppression that all women,
patriarchy,
regardless.
And I think it's really important from a feminist perspective to then bring in this concept of the virgin whore complex and how it's weaponized by power and essentially men who have that power to oppress all women. You know, the demonization of the sex worker is all connected to the demonization of women's bodies and slut shaming and women's agency, therefore. So the idea that a man, if he has relations with many people, is fertile and he's successful for being promiscuous, but a woman has to be an innocent virgin, you know, forever until she meets the perfect man. And then if anything happens anywhere along the way, any agency, any exploration, any life, then she's ruined. And that kind of helps to, it's a real powerful form of social control, which I think affects all women. I'm sure we can agree here. And it also plays the kind of people with the least power against each other, that people then say, well, I'm not that thing. I'm well respectable. You know, I have my dignity, you don't. And people manage to fight amongst each other about that, which I think is also a way of reinforcing things. And I find most interesting, if we look at today, you know, objectification is a serious issue that affects all of us, particularly cisgendered women, and the kind of commodification of bodies. But why do we blame, you know, as I say, kind of the small town porn actor for that? Why do we blame the working class person who's getting money directly from a rich man into their purse under that system of objectification, over the Hollywood producers producing those films, making mega millions, and then affecting so many thousands of girls, you know, who are just turning teenage and consuming this media and feeling this pressure to put on, you know, gallons of makeup and be thinner than a stick and unhealthily thin and all these kind of things. You know, where do we place that blame and where do we look for solidarity? And actually the working migrant mother who is surviving under that system and getting paid directly to her purse to be able to spend that on her kids and look after them well and survive, probably is the least place that we should look to blame, is the kind of perspective that certainly groups like English Collective of Prostitutes would take. And connected to that is the fact that, you know, you mentioned criminalisation and you know, sodomy was heavily criminalised, sex work was criminalised, you know. Who gets locked up for these things, and who gets raided, and how do those raids, what is the narrative in those raids? Because if you have an infantilization of someone that they're abused, when you have the Soho raids in 2013 in Soho, you would imagine they would then give those people new opportunities, but in fact they just criminalize them, deport people as well. And so I think there's such a deep hypocrisy kind of strain running through all of that. And yeah, no one benefits from this false dichotomy. And what's also applied is this idea that you have to love your job to do it, and therefore sex workers must be hating what they're doing. And I think that's a very interesting concept, because we don't say to someone, oh, well, you know, I'm an estate agent and that's my life vocation. I really enjoy being an estate agent and I love property. I'm really fascinated by it. Equally, our other friend might say, well, I just do it to pay the rent and I'm looking for something else eventually. And we don't kind of cast moral judgments of whether those people should be doing that job. Same thing with domestic labour. But with sex work, because we're all oppressed around sex and we're all repressed and feel pressured, we kind of cast judgment. And I think that speaks to Victorian society at the time really importantly as well, that, you know, why was London such a hotbed? Why was everyone so hungry for this thing? Is because the message going out there is that this doesn't happen and we don't speak about it and it goes under the carpet. And And I think that, you know, BDSM, and you talked about these Etonians kind of acting out their, you know, their spankings from school on sex workers and in brothels, you know, BDSM is so period, because the moment you repress something, the moment you push it under, it explodes, and people do it 10 times more. Obviously, prohibition in the US in the 20s is a really great example of that as well.
I think it's like there's two things happening at the same time. There's like extreme repression and there's extreme libertines as well. And there are, you know, also records of lesbian encounters between women. Now I've started looking for it. I've found a lot more. I found card playing. That's apparently what women used to do. But also, like, you've got some examples, some great examples in here. You've got like a menu for a brothel, which has all sorts of different things available for people, but it also has male studs for heterosexual women.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so actually once, particularly amongst the upper classes, once you'd produced a male heir, you were free to take lovers. And so actually there is quite a big difference within women of higher standings who were educated, who could be visiting brothels, lesbian brothels, or getting young men, to the younger, the working class women who are working in them. But it, like you said, you mentioned the Victorian times, when this project is happening in the Georgian times largely, which is just after Puritanism and kind of extreme patriarchy. And then we've got the Georgian period, and then the Victorians. Both Puritans and Victorians really high rates of church going, and not so much in the Georgian times. People stopped going to church. And there's a lot more kind of discussions around atheism, about freedom, about liberty. You know, in America, we've got Thomas Jefferson pronouncing life, love, and the pursuit of happiness and liberty and all that. And within that, this is a period in humanity where people are thinking about feeling and sentiment. And at the end, you know, the start of the Romantic period of the Victorian times, you have Wuthering Heights and all these romantic novels. And there's been an encouragement to find companionship in relationships as well. Also, just as well, that it wasn't, we can talk about the difficulties in class and capitalism, but it was also a really exciting period as well of freedom, that we had the explosion of the printing press. We had mass production of pornography. We were importing dildos from Italy. We had condoms coming in from Paris. That it was also a really sort of for everyone.
Exploration, yeah.
And I think that's quite, you know, we shouldn't marginalise that. I think we should look at that a lot more.
And on that, and continuing to connect this to theatre, because I'm aware we've got little time left.
Yes.
I think that I love this quote, again from the same chapter in City of Sin. Vauxhall was one of the most famous pleasure gardens. We're talking actually around 1660 here, so it's quite early. The most famous pleasure gardens where, for just a shilling, the visitors could enjoy orchestras, dazzling firework displays, dancing, and the opportunity to indulge in a little flirtation in the decorated alcove set aside for just such a purpose. And later on, back in the garden, another development was taking place, the return of the bathhouse or bagno. These bathhouses were expensive, exclusive, and devoted to anything but getting clean. The legendary Casanova tells us that during a trip to London, he visited the bagnos, where a rich man can sup, bathe, and sleep with a fashionable courtesan, of which species there are many in London. I think that this connection of the sensory and sex work being an extension of the sensory, and people being able to come and explore, is really critical, and it's also well documented, and it's well connected to Puritanism versus this kind of march forward of enlightenment, march forward of also capitalism, I guess, not just industrialization, but also this kind of libertarianism, as you were talking about, Ray. I'm going to read you a quote from the Crossbones Cemetery. Now, it's a bit of a sad context, but it's very revealing. The Crossbones Cemetery is in Southwark to this day. And it's steeped in urban history. It's become an important place for sex work activists. It dates back to the late medieval times when, legend has it, the site became a graveyard for single women, a euphemism for sex workers. In 1107, the area, now called South Bank, included the site also where the National Theatre stands, was gifted by King Henry II to the Bishop of Winchester. Now, because that area lay outside of the jurisdiction of the City of London, it became an early red light district, because otherwise illegal activities, which in King Henry's London, City of London, included brothel keeping and theatre. Theatre was criminalised, as were brothels, were licensed in Southwark and controlled by the bishop, who collected taxes from them, essentially putting the church in the role of pimp. He was the bishop and he was collecting taxes from the brothels and from the theatres. The existing shrine there today, which you should definitely go visit once lockdown is ended, is a memorial garden called the Goose Garden. And it's so named because the women who once worked there were called geese because they wore white aprons. King Henry's ordinance of 1161 made it illegal to traffic or enslave these workers. By law, they were free to board at their pleasure. On the other hand, the law denied the workers from marrying or receiving a Christian burial. Of course, especially at that time, that was a great social stigma to not have a Christian burial. The burial ground was unconsecrated and used for the poor and unnamed. It became overcrowded and was closed in the 19th century as a public health hazard. Excavations in the 1990s revealed thousands of unmarked graves. Bodies buried, piled on top of each other. Sorry to share this today, folks. Tests revealed the majority of the bodies were women and infants, which supports the theory that it was used to serve the sex industry. Once again, hypocrisy screams at us that the church was running these places and yet refused to consecrate and hallow their graves. But what I find really interesting there again is that this is connected to theatre. And if we look at early theatre, if we look at, famously, obviously in Shakespeare's time, female characters were portrayed by men because women weren't allowed to act. As women did start to get involved in theatre, very often, theatre was a very lowly profession, very physical, bodily, sensory, underpaid, often relied on patrons of the arts, as we know. And women in theatre were often synonymous with, or considered synonymous with, sex workers. So, they were treated as if they were just sex workers, and many of them were sex workers to survive their life of art. And many theatres had brothels nearby or above them. So the history of theatre and performance and performativity is so intimately connected to sex work. And I think that also speaks to the performativity that the Mollies had at the time as well. They had this very performative, very gender-bending, very ritualistic relationship with each other, which to me, surely, I think maybe in the history books that we read, written by generally these richer men and people slightly on the outside, we hear this antagonism, but probably at the time, there might have been a lot of solidarity. There might have been a sisterhood, siblinghood. And certainly if you look in the queer liberation movements of the 50s and 60s, a lot of sex workers were involved and female sex workers. Why do we have this terrible trope of the fag and their hag? I think that sisterhood and siblinghood of people who are being judged because of their gender and their sexuality, comes all the way through the ages.
Yeah, from the witches, sort of being persecuted at the same time as the homosexuals around Europe from the 16th century. Absolutely. To pick up on that, because I realise that we've just talked for an hour, can we talk about what we're going to be doing? What the singing workshops for the Mollies Masquerade going to look like or sound like?
Yeah, shall we give it 15? Can everyone give me a kind of thumbs up if they can stay in our 15, or if that's too long for anyone? That's absolutely fine. I understand. Thank you so much. I think that'll give us time for questions at the end. Just so you know, in the project, I'll be intending to do some songwriting workshops, and in those we will think about contemporary experience and identity. We will think about welcome. We will think about, as we're learning more and more about the history of the Mollies, we'll think about how we can together write some of that into fun songs. And we're also going to look at how we can revive some of the songs that are passed down. Now, whether or not the chords survive, maybe they do, maybe they don't. We know that some of the lyrics do. I think Ray is probably pulling out a Blue Peter one now.
I haven't read it yet.
Look at that.
So it's got some ballads in. I'm ready to get stuck into the ballads.
Of course, there were so many ballad houses and so much. Lieder was getting very big at the time. And in the UK, you had a lot of, song and working class song that was emerging, especially in London. So really excited to get stuck into that. I imagine, you know, we've got 12 weeks and we want to also sing these songs. I'm going to be giving workshops with no experience necessary in vocal technique. You know, our members from Sex Workers Opera, within the first year, in a very short time, ended up singing arias on stage together and jazz anthems and that kind of thing. But over the years, we did vocal training as well. So I'll try to squeeze some of that in. And for me, it's really special when people jump in and sing and haven't done so before. Maybe we could aim for 6 songs. Could be that 2 are historical, queer-historical, 2 are our imaginations, 2 maybe speak to our contemporary experience and identity today. I think that could be really fun. I thought it could be fun for you guys. I could play a song from Sex Workers Opera for you. So you get a sense of, you know, what we wrote. So this is a song which was, so all songs in the show were written by the group, Sex Worker-led creative process. And this was a song reflecting around, you know, the saviours we were talking about earlier, and this kind of Christian character in, not religiously Christian in Moulin Rouge, this starving poet who comes to save the sex worker, and how clients always kind of want to, you know, pretty woman, let's say the pretty woman archetype. And the group wrote the song and the lyrics, and it's called the Worker-Client Duet. If you'll give me 1 second, I'll just kind of get, see if I can figure out the microphone stuff. I haven't warmed up my voice and I haven't practiced piano for centuries, so I apologise if anything terrible happens. But it's fun because I got this. Can you see it? You can't really see it. Can you see it? There you go. Got a cheeky little e-piano. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear this? Is it a bit low?
Bit low.
A bit low. Lovely. That can be sorted out. What if we do that and do that and do that? No, nothing coming through there. 1 second. My apologies.
While we're doing this, if anybody has any questions for Idols before we finish, feel free. Maybe we can get to them after the song. Or you can always just email me another time just for a chat or a Zoom.
How's that?
Good.
Yeah, is it kind of loud or is it kind of quiet?
No, it's
Lovely. This is a song called the Worker-Client Duet, and I have to play 2 different characters, so I'm going to have to do my best and see what happens. Oh, we've got a great question coming already. I love it. Thank you. Get me a little pedal. Are you leaving so soon? We've only just begun. I've got work to do, but I'm glad we shared some fun. Stay with me now, now we are lovers. I like you, you know, but there are others. I know you've got work, but aren't we special? You said it's true. This is where all the Disney cherubs come in. Put a garland on the client. If we went into a restaurant. Oh, sorry, it's the client. That's the worker who says that. If we went into a restaurant, say we went there every day, you thank the chef profusely, but then refuse to pay. But darling, this is different. It's your body, not a meal. You've made me your lover now. Can you deny that this is real? Yes, I fulfill your fantasy, as the chef does with his food. Bloody hard work work it was, respect where it's due. But I'm lonely, live in the city, so many people, I touch no one. Yeah, we're all lonely, I can't take that away, but I'm good at my job and I've got bills to pay. I see myself with you 30 years ago in my youth, in a romance pure and true. This is my job, what can I do? There's so many people just like you. There's so many people just like you. Oh, so many lonely people. 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 You made me feel so beautiful. I was young again for you. The weather is so cold outside, but in tide eternal youth. I love to learn your secrets. I love to make you feel. I love to be your healer. Yes, that part is real. You've given me so many things, my darling, I leave here with wings. Where they exchange cash. You've given me so many things, my darling, I leave here with wings. You've given me so many things, my darling, I leave here with wings. There we go. So that was a song written, thank you guys. That's a song written by the group called The Work Client Duet. A very silly, playful song. Obviously there's loads of kind of eye rolling and frustration on the part of the sex worker with this kind of besotted client who can't really accept that it's just a transaction. But yeah, hopefully we can write some of our own songs using our tried and tested songwriting methods, which no experience necessary, where we write the lyrics, we can even come up with the chords as well. I'll teach at least 3 of you, it's my commitment, to play piano in and I'll get one of you playing the piano, or a couple of you playing the piano for it as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. That has really made my day, actually. I really love that. I'm just going to look at some of the questions that people have sent. So John Haig said, I was wondering about the intersection of addiction as a detriment of undertaking sex work in the 18th century. I guess it would have been gin. And was that an issue in molly houses? I'm not sure of the answer on that one. I know that gin, you know, all Hogarth paintings, you got lots of drunk women dropping their babies. And obviously
it's good to talk about drugs and sex in general, really, just for fun, to create controversy. No, I think sex work and drugs are always conflated and addiction is cited. Now, if you're more poor and you're more working class, you're more vulnerable to addiction issues. Maybe if you're in a poorer area and there's more drugs around you, you're more vulnerable to addiction issues. But, you know, we don't in the same breath talk about bankers and cocaine. We don't in the same breath talk about politicians, certainly, and cocaine. We don't talk about the BBC and their meth problem. And yet they're very happy to put on newscasts that conflate the two. So, you know, of course, in any world where you are working with a commodity that you've got all the time as your body, and you may develop an addiction issue, and you may end up, as we started dissecting what is sexual labor earlier, you know, people trade sex for many things. It may well be for drugs if you've got an addiction. But I think the issue there is poverty. As they say, outlaw poverty, not prostitution. So, you know, poverty meaning less ability to deal with addiction issues, and more susceptibility to also be consuming, may I say it, lower quality drugs, which are designed to addict much more ugly ways. And if you look a bit at the kind of history of class and race as well, or racialization in the US, for example, you look at how drugs were often pushed into poorer areas, and also more areas of people of color as well. So there's a kind of, I think there's a lot of questions around why that stereotype comes up that are good to kind of unpick. Not to say that people don't exchange sex for substances, but as I say, it's a big problem in the BBC too.
Okay, I'm going to go on to another one. Stuart is asking, what aspects of Molly house life do you see becoming songs? Is anybody interested in, because
that's a question for you guys, for all of us.
All of us, because we're all part of the project, and we're all, is there anything that maybe Milu and Lou, that if you think, is there any parts of the Molly life that you think you might make it into, maybe not songs, but dresses or embroidery? Is there any areas that interest you particularly? I can start. I'm quite interested in the births.
I know you are. I can't wait to make something about that.
I'm fascinated by it. So,
it would be just so great to perform as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I actually wanted to chuck something in, a song about the spoon dolls. Oh yes, yes, we've got to. And then they've got to, each of them have got to act it out, right? We've got to do a kind of pantomime puppet show thing.
One of this book as well, it gives you the following chapter after the sex workers. I think it's sent to everyone. It talks about sex workers in parks would have trays. If you turn the doll the other way around, it was a dildo. So I was like, there's all this kind of dildo baby doll thing going on this period. I'm like, what is this about? And I'm really curious about also just the role of the mothers. Like, one of the quotes that I found actually from a great book that looked at the family, marriage, gender and sex from 1500 to 1800 by Lawrence Stone. Great academic book, but he talked about the fact that they were blaming the mothers for Mollies. Mothers get blamed for everything in society.
Yeah.
They said it's because the mothers are mollifying the sons that you've ended up with effeminate men. And so the mother figure, and the fact that we also, from Pose and do you know what I mean, that scene, that the mothers within the mothers of houses, I'm really interested in this. And also because I'm a single mother myself, do you know what I mean? And I think there is a discussion here about class as well. As you say, outlaw poverty, not prostitution. We can look at, comparatively today, that there's more women doing care work without PPE. There's a lot of contemporary relevance of this discussion to right now, I think. So, yeah. Anybody
I love that, Stuart. You said a song about the Society for Good Manners. I mean, just manners. It's just such a great word, isn't it? Oh, your manners, and this performativity. And again, I spoke a bit earlier about people's ability to kind of to jump class or social mobility, often encoded in sex work. Well, if we think about, the ballroom culture in the US, and you think about, a lot of drag in general, we think of this kind of posh upper class woman being performed over and over again. And so often poorer people's ability to kind of play into that world and perform class. And that also kind of ties in a little bit to the acceptability politics that would have been played. There's a quote, I can't remember if it was in the City of Sin book, or maybe it was Ray, you talking about it earlier, that some of the Mollies wouldn't dare to be told that they would exchange sex for money, for example, and that's again this performativity of, I'm not in that rank, I'm in this thing, and the ability to go to a place where you get to choose your social status and access to that. If you look at ballroom culture, a lot of it was very, very poor black men in the US copying the high fashion world and all these glamorous dresses and these kind of very beautiful women on the front of all these magazines who get to have all this time and money to spend on luxury and spend on beautiful clothes, you know, and getting to reperform that, and people often making their own dresses from, you know, from materials they find, you know.
That also connects us as well to when we look at how many women in the 18th century were also working as seamstresses, who may then be taken as the head of the fashion house and then rejected as well, that there's actually a really strong link within the fashion world. Somebody actually, when I worked in Russia, once I worked for a wealthy Russian woman, and she had a daughter who was also very beautiful. And I said to her, oh, is she going to be a model as well? And she went, she said, I don't know if it's the same in England, but in Russia, if you want to be a model, you want to be a sex worker. And I was like, oh, no, I'm not sure we do. So, and I was like, but actually that's
the way it's done.
Yeah. And I was like, in this book, there's a really great kind of list of a woman's expenses. And if you are able to take, you know, maybe you're not directly handing them 30 quid, but maybe you're taking them to Bond Street and buying them a nice outfit, or, you know,
expected to be constantly beautiful in constantly new clothes, in constant, and not have a labour job. Where's that money coming from? You know, that's the ultimate one, isn't it?
Good. Okay.
We've got juicy material for songs. That's good. I've just saved the chat, so we've got that written down, which is nice.
Oh, thank you. I think this is it. Unless anybody's got any, I think we're good. We're 20 minutes over. Really enjoyed that. Thank you all for coming. Lovely to see you all. Okay, we should be back in about 2 weeks' time. I'll send you another one where we're going to be talking to Sian Kidd about puppetry and more about theatre.
So excited.
Her work and what we're going to be doing in that element, the sort of the creative part of the project. So lovely to see you all, and see you soon. Okay, have a good weekend. Bye.
Bye, folks. Thank you for coming.